The cardboard box nearly slipped from my hands when the door opened. For a second, I forgot why I was standing on that porch, forgot the homemade lemon bread my sister had insisted I take to the new neighbor, forgot the bright afternoon sun warming the quiet street behind me. All I could see was the woman standing in the doorway, one hand still resting on the brass handle, her face older than the one I had carried in my memory for almost 15 years, but unmistakably hers. Mara Whitmore. The first girl I had ever loved. The girl who had disappeared from my life without a goodbye that made sense. Her eyes widened, and the polite smile she had prepared for a stranger slowly faded. Then, with sunlight falling across her face and something almost painful trembling in her expression, she looked straight at me and said, "You still remember me?" I had imagined seeing Mara again hundreds of times when I was younger. In every version, I had something clever to say. Standing there at 37 years old, with a loaf of lemon bread between us and 15 years of unanswered questions pressing against my chest, I could barely breathe. If you believe kindness can survive heartbreak and that sometimes people deserve a second chance after life pulls them apart, please like this video, comment below, share it with someone who still believes in meaningful connections, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Your support helps us keep telling stories about the moments that remind us how much one act of understanding can change a life. My name is Rowan Mercer, and until that afternoon, I had convinced myself that the past had finally stopped following me. I had moved into Cedar Hollow only 3 weeks earlier after buying a modest 2-story house at the end of a tree-lined street where children rode bicycles in the afternoons and retired couples watered flowers before dinner. I worked remotely as an architectural illustrator, which meant I could live almost anywhere, and after 12 exhausting years in Chicago, anywhere quiet sounded perfect. My mother had died the previous winter, my engagement had ended 6 months before that, and somewhere between cleaning out my childhood home and signing papers that separated my life from the woman I thought I would marry, I realized I had spent too many years chasing versions of happiness that looked impressive from the outside but never felt peaceful inside. Cedar Hollow was supposed to be my reset. A place with no history attached to it. Then history moved into the house next door. Mara stepped aside and invited me in, though neither of us seemed certain whether that was a good idea. Her living room was filled with half-open moving boxes, rolled rugs, framed photographs wrapped in brown paper, and the pleasant disorder of someone who had arrived only days earlier. Through the large back windows, afternoon light poured across the wooden floor. She looked different, of course. Time had softened some things and sharpened others. Her dark auburn hair was shorter now, brushing her shoulders instead of falling almost to her waist like it had when we were 19. Fine lines appeared beside her eyes when she smiled nervously. But she still rubbed her thumb against the side of her index finger when she was anxious. I noticed immediately. 15 years disappeared in that tiny movement that we talked carefully at first, like people walking across thin ice. She asked how long I had lived there. I asked when she had arrived. She told me she had moved in 4 days earlier and had been meaning to introduce herself to the neighbors once the boxes stopped looking like they were multiplying. I laughed, and she laughed too, but there was an awkwardness beneath it. Then a little boy appeared at the top of the staircase. He was maybe 9, thin and serious looking, with Mara's dark eyes and an armful of plastic dinosaur figures. Mara's entire expression changed when she saw him. She introduced him as her son, Felix. The boy studied me with the suspicion children reserve for unfamiliar adults, then asked whether I lived in the blue house next door. When I said yes, he informed me that my backyard had a broken fence board and that his soccer ball had already gone through it twice. Mara apologized, embarrassed, but I told him I would fix it before the third invasion. For the first time since she opened the door, Mara smiled without sadness. That smile stayed with me long after I returned home. That evening, I sat on my back steps with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands and stared at the fence dividing our properties. I could hear Felix laughing somewhere inside Mara's house. Pots clattered in her kitchen. A radio played quietly through an open window. Ordinary sounds. Yet every one of them seemed impossible. Mara and I had met during our first year of college. I was studying architecture, she was studying elementary education, and we had both taken a photography elective because it fit conveniently between required courses. We became friends after being assigned to photograph the same abandoned railway station. Friendship turned into coffee, coffee turned into long walks, and those walks turned into the kind of young love that makes two people believe they have discovered something no one else in history has ever understood. For nearly 3 years, Mara was woven into everything I imagined about my future. Then, during our final year, her father suffered a massive stroke. Her family lived hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania, and Mara left campus suddenly to help her mother care for him. At first, we called every day. Then every few days. Then once a week. She was exhausted, frightened, and trying to keep her family together while I was finishing my degree and applying for internships. I wanted to help, but I was 22 and had no idea how to love someone whose entire life was collapsing. 3 months after she left, I received a short email saying she wasn't coming back to school and that I should move forward without her. I called until her number stopped working. I wrote letters that came back unopened. Eventually, anger replaced grief because anger was easier to carry. I told myself she had chosen to leave. What I never knew was why. The next afternoon, Felix's soccer ball came flying through the broken fence board again. It rolled across my grass and stopped beside my shoe while I was trimming a hedge. A moment later he appeared, apologetic and slightly terrified, clearly expecting me to be annoyed. Instead, I kicked the ball back through the gap and asked him if he wanted help repairing the fence. For the next hour, Felix handed me screws while I replaced the damaged plank. He talked almost continuously once he decided I was safe. He told me he loved science, hated mushrooms, had recently learned how to whistle badly, and was nervous about starting at a new school. Then, as children sometimes do, he said something enormous with absolutely no warning. His father had died 2 years earlier. I stopped tightening the screw. Felix stared at the ground and explained that his dad's heart had been sick for a long time. He said his mother had wanted a new house because their old apartment made her sad. Then he changed the subject and asked whether I had ever built a treehouse. That night, Mara came over to thank me for fixing the fence. We sat on my porch in the late afternoon, drinking iced tea while sunlight filtered through the maple branches above us. For several minutes we talked about harmless things. The neighborhood. Felix's school. My work. Then I told her I was sorry about her husband. Her eyes dropped to the glass in her hands. His name had been Adrian. They had met when Mara was 25, several years after she left college. He was a paramedic, patient and funny, and apparently one of those people who could make strangers feel comfortable within minutes. They married 2 years later. Felix was born shortly afterward. When Felix was 6, Adrian was diagnosed with a rare heart condition. He lived another 17 months. As Mara spoke, I felt something unexpected. Not jealousy. Not resentment, gratitude. This man I had never met had loved her during years when I had not been there. He had given her a family. He had been beside her through struggles I knew nothing about. When she finished, silence settled between us. Then Mara finally told me what had happened 15 years earlier. Her father's stroke had left him partially paralyzed. Her mother became overwhelmed almost immediately. Medical bills accumulated. Their insurance covered less than expected. Mara dropped out of school intending to return within 1 semester, but within weeks she was working 2 jobs while helping care for her father at night. She had been ashamed. Every time I called, I talked about graduation, job interviews, apartments, and the future we had once planned. She listened from a house where bills were stacked on the kitchen table and her mother sometimes cried behind the bathroom door. Mara said she began believing she would ruin my future if she remained part of it. So she ended things, not because she stopped loving me, because she thought leaving me was an act of love. I stared at her, stunned by how tragic and absurd that sounded. After 15 years. I asked why she never explained later. Her answer hurt even more. By the time her father died 18 months afterward, she had convinced herself too much time had passed. She imagined I hated her. Then she heard through an old classmate that I had moved to Chicago and was doing well. She decided interfering would be selfish. 2 people had spent years protecting each other from pain by creating far more of it. For the next several weeks, Mara and I became neighbors before we became anything else. That mattered that I helped Felix assemble a second-hand basketball hoop in their driveway. Mara brought me soup when I caught a summer cold. I repaired a cabinet door in her kitchen while she laughed at my inability to follow simple instructions without redesigning the entire hinge system. Sometimes we sat outside while Felix played, talking until the afternoon light turned golden, but neither of us pretended the past had disappeared. There were difficult moments. One Saturday, Mara found an old photograph while unpacking. It showed us at 21, standing beside the railway station from the photography class where we first met. She brought it outside and handed it to me without speaking. Looking at those two young faces felt strange. We had believed love alone could protect people from everything. Life had proven otherwise. I asked Mara whether she regretted leaving. She took a long time before answering. She regretted the way she left, she said. She regretted deciding for me what I could handle. But she could not regret everything that came afterward, because loving Adrian and becoming Felix's mother were parts of her life she would never erase. I understood, and strangely, that answer made trusting her easier. Real second chances are not about pretending the years between never happened. They are about accepting that those years shaped people into someone different. My own confession came a few days later. I told Mara about my failed engagement. Her name had been Celeste. We had dated for 5 years, lived together for 3, and planned an expensive wedding neither of us seemed particularly excited about. Eventually Celeste admitted she felt as if some part of me was always somewhere else. At the time, I thought she meant work. Standing beside Mara 15 years later, I wondered whether she had meant something deeper. Still, I refused to romanticize what was happening. Mara was grieving a husband. I was recovering from my own broken future. Familiarity could easily disguise itself as destiny. So when Mara reached for my hand one evening as we sat watching Felix chase fireflies across both yards, I gently pulled away. Her face fell. I told her I cared about her too much to become an escape from grief. She understood, but for several days afterwards, distance returned between us. Then something happened that changed everything. Felix disappeared. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon in late August. Mara thought he was playing at a classmate's house 3 doors down. The classmate's mother thought Felix had gone home an hour earlier. By 4:30, no one knew where he was. Mara came pounding on my door, pale and shaking. Within minutes, neighbors were searching yards, alleys, the small wooded trail behind the subdivision, and the nearby playground. Mara kept calling Felix's name until her voice became hoarse. Police were contacted. Then I remembered something Felix had told me weeks earlier. His father used to take him to an old pedestrian bridge beyond the woods to watch trains. Mara and I ran. We found him sitting beneath that bridge with his knees pulled against his chest and Adrian's old baseball cap in his hands. He had gotten scared about starting school the following week. He missed his father. He thought moving had meant leaving him behind. Mara collapsed onto her knees and wrapped both arms around him. I turned away, giving them privacy, but then Felix reached one arm toward me too. So I knelt beside them. For several minutes, 3 people sat beneath an old bridge while afternoon trains thundered somewhere in the distance. That was when I understood something I had been resisting, that I could never replace Adrian, that I didn't want to. Love was not a chair where only one person could ever sit. A heart could carry grief and still make room for something new. After that day, everything changed slowly. Mara and I began seeing each other intentionally, not accidentally. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became Sunday walks with Felix. We talked about boundaries, fear, guilt, and whether 2 people with this much history could build something that belonged to the present instead of constantly trying to repair the past. There were setbacks. Mara sometimes pulled away after moments of happiness because feeling happy made her guilty. I sometimes became quiet when memories of being abandoned returned unexpectedly. Instead of disappearing from each other, we learned to say what was happening. That became the foundation neither of us possessed. When we were 22, months later, on a crisp spring afternoon, I rebuilt the entire fence between our properties. Felix came outside and stared at the new boards with disappointment. He asked why I had fixed all the gaps. I told him I had not. Then I showed him the small wooden gate I had built between our yards. Mara stood on the other side watching, her eyes filled with tears. There are moments in life that look insignificant from the outside but somehow hold entire histories inside them. That little gate was one of those moments. 15 years earlier, Mara had closed a door because she believed love meant letting someone go. now we were learning that sometimes love meant leaving a gate open. A year after she moved next door, Mara and I returned to the abandoned railway station where we had first met in college. It had been restored and turned into a small community museum. Felix came with us carrying an old camera I had given him. The three of us stood in almost the same place where that faded photograph had been taken. Felix insisted on taking another one. This time Mara and I were older. There were lines around our eyes, losses behind our smiles, and no illusions that life would always be easy, but when Felix pressed the shutter, Mara was holding my hand. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of someone you never fully forgot, or made you believe that healing sometimes arrives in unexpected forms, please like the video, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to Dream Discipline. Every interaction helps these stories reach someone who may need to hear that a painful ending does not always have to remain the final chapter. And before this story ends, I have one special request: comment "Leave the gate open" if you believe genuine love deserves honesty, patience, and a second chance when the time is right. People sometimes ask whether I wish Mara had never left all those years ago. I used to think the answer should be yes, but life is more complicated than that. If she had stayed, perhaps we would have married young. Perhaps we would have been happy. Perhaps we would have broken each other in entirely different ways. There is no way to know. What I do know is that the Mara who stood beside me 15 years later had been shaped by sacrifice, motherhood, grief, courage, and survival. And the man who answered his neighbor's door had been shaped by disappointment, ambition, loneliness, and loss. That we were no longer two young people trying to continue an unfinished romance. That we were two adults choosing each other with our eyes open. One sunny Saturday afternoon, almost 2 years after that first knock, Mara and Felix carried the last boxes from her house through the little gate into mine. Not because she was disappearing from the house next door, but because we had decided to make one home together. Before going inside, Mara stopped beside that gate. She looked at me with the same expression she had worn the afternoon she first opened her door. Then she asked whether I still remembered her. This time, I knew exactly what to say. I told her I remembered the girl she had been. But I loved the woman standing in front of me, and somewhere beyond us, Felix kicked a soccer ball through the open gate, laughing as it rolled across both yards as though the two had always belonged together.